And the talk that I'm going to do tonight is not what are the plants that are on the landscape that are the problem, although I'm happy to talk about that as well, but it's going to be more overall, what am I seeing as the problems, and how to tackle this as overall. So my first slide here is a chickadee with a caterpillar ready to go. And this is going to help me tell you what the big deal is with the non-native invasive plants that we have coming into our landscape. So definition, so that we all know exactly what an invasive plant is. This is from the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group. So they started out with this when they were formed back, I don't know, a long time ago. But they're non-native, invasive plants are non-native species that have come in and have or are likely to spread into our native or minimally managed plant communities and cause economic or environmental harm. And they'll develop self-sustaining populations that become dominant and disruptive to those native communities. So that's where we're starting. Those are the species we're talking about. We're talking about big numbers here as far as what's the big deal. 2015, almost 10 years ago, there were over 100 million acres. It's substantially more than that now. I don't have the actual numbers. They are starting to come in again. You know, people have been doing some more research on that, and I'll try and update this slide so that when I get those numbers. But at this point, it's probably at least 2 or 3 times that now is what I'm thinking. We lose 3 million acres every year, which is about half the size of Rhode Island. That's a lot of land. We lose a lot daily, just publicly land that gets invaded. And one of the things that's near and dear to my heart, 42% of endangered species are listed in part because of invasive species impacting them. And 16% of extinctions, of rare plant extinctions, are due solely to invasive alien species, both plants and animals coming in. That's a lot. That's really scary. In 2010, the control of invasive species were estimated to cost about $26 billion a year. More recently, in 2019, the estimated cost globally was $423 billion. That just is amazing. And that's the economic cost. That's not just controlling them. So that's a newer number coming in. So where did these plants come from? Well, a lot of them actually have come in and are still coming in via the horticultural trade. So people going to their local garden store, they can buy all kinds of things. The arboretums have brought in a lot of introduced plants. They wanted to get plants from around the world, and so they brought them in, and then they'd sell them out. You'd say, this is a nice one, we could sell this. So a couple of those examples are the purple loosestrife, Japanese barberry, winged euonymus. My organization, Mass Wildlife, really guilty of spreading some of these. Multiflora and autumn olive were given out to people who were hunters. You know, plant these. These would be good winter food for wildlife. Not so good anymore. And some of them probably came in accidentally via ballast or on pallets, or we're not entirely sure how these things have gotten here. But with the world trade moving around the way that it does, it's not hard for something that's slightly invasive to get moved into our area. So I mentioned this before, the Massachusetts, MIPAG, Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group. And there is now a Massachusetts prohibited plant list. If you type that into Google, you will get that list. Or you can go to MIPAG invasive list and you will get the list. The research was completed for that list, for the Massachusetts prohibited plant list, initially by MyPag, which is, there's a number of botanists on it, there's a number of researchers, there are nursery owners. We have some people who are botanists who are from conservation organizations and representing, their organization on it, like TNC, and the trustees have representatives on it. And that list was accepted by Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, or MDAR. MDAR is the state agency that regulates all the sales of all plants. And they also regulate and enforce that prohibited plant list. So when there are plants that are being sold on the prohibited plant list and somebody reports it, MDAR sends people to the store that's selling it and researches, finds out whether or not they actually are selling it or not. One of the examples is when Christmas Tree Shop was up and around still selling things, they would always sell bittersweet. And I know MDAR would go in and look at it, and it actually ended up being not the invasive bittersweet, but our rare bittersweet that they were selling. I bought one at one point just to see how it would do, and it didn't do very well. Maybe that's why Christmas Tree is closing. I don't think so. But anyway, it is something that MDAR did research it, did look at it, and we had gotten a number of calls about that. They also will go to local farms if they know that somebody has made wreaths out of bittersweet, for example, the invasive one, and they will say, no, can't, we'll close this down, you can't sell this. So MyPag, which I happen to be a member of, is continuing to research other potentially invasive species, plant species. We have not listed everything. The prohibited plant list is not all inclusive. So there are still more invasive plants than are on that list. So I want you to know that that is a work in progress. It's not finished. There are a couple of upcoming hearings that MDAR is doing so that they can figure out whether or not they should list some species or whether or not they should allow some loopholes. So that's where they are with that. So what's the big deal? Well, we have an impact on wildlife species. Our native birds and our native small mammals need native berries and native seeds. And they need those native insects to eat. They don't survive on a lot of the introduced things. Invasive plants shade out our native plants. And if we don't have native plants, we have no caterpillars eating those native plants, no native caterpillars eating them, and no native caterpillars, well, there's no food for the birds to feed their young. That chickadee at the beginning that I showed you takes 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed its family of 4. So it needs about 70% native plants in their home range. That's a lot. So it's mind-boggling how much they eat and how many they take. And we still have a lot of insects out there, but they're starting to drop. And part of that is because of the invasive plants. And our native bugs need native plants. So another issue that's coming up, and as I said to Steve before, one of the things that just keeps coming up in my life is climate change. I'm really concerned about this. With climate change, Massachusetts is going to have a warmer climate. We already do. Yes, we just got an ice storm at the end of March, but 20 years ago, that would not have been exceptional. We would have gotten lots of ice storms, and we would have been getting snow instead of ice into it. So we've got invasive plants that are now in the southern states, such as here in South Carolina. Well, they're moving up. And if we end up being as warm as South Carolina, we're going to have the plants that are already a problem there, and they're going to become a problem here. So Massachusetts is actually, and New England as a whole, is actually expected to be on the receiving end of several invasives. So we've got a couple of photos here of some invasive plants here. Norway maple, cypress surge, goutweed, Japanese stiltgrass, multiflora rose, barberry, autumn olive, etc. It's overwhelming, no question. Lots and lots of plants there. That's not even all of them. That's only some of them that I was able to find pictures of quickly. Why are these plants invasive? How did they become so invasive? What are their characteristics? Well, we already know that they're non-native. And so one of the things about that is there's few or no insects that are going to eat them. You just don't find, unless they're very closely related to something that is already here that's native, the insects won't eat them. It doesn't taste good to them. Often, our invasive plants have high seed production, or they have long-lived seed that can stay in the seed bank that is just hanging out in the soil until it's a good time for them to come up. The seed is often easily transported to a new location by wind or by birds, or by sticking to fur, or to shoes, or to car and truck tires as people are driving. The roots are capable of sending up new ramets, or suckers. They have the ability to adapt to lots of different conditions. They usually grow quickly and can shade out native plants. Some of them can self-pollinate, so you only need to have one plant and you can get a population. And many of them have more than one of these characters. So where do they come from? Well, we already, you hear about things that are the Norway maple, the Norway spruce, the Japanese barberry. That's because all of that is within the temperate zone. And this is the sweet spot for us. I mean, we're in that zone too. So our plants are actually causing problems in some of the Asian and European countries. The ones that we already have had a lot of trade going back and forth between these countries. We've just started to get some plants from South America and Africa and Australia are coming in as invasives in here. And that's kind of a concern. So a few examples here. One of the ones with really high seed production are purple loosestrife. One with the long seed bank longevity, high seed bank longevity is mile a minute. We know that the seeds, once they get into the soil, can last for at least 7 years. It's a long time. So if you end up being able to pull them all up, you're going to have to keep going back and checking it for at least 7 years. Ones with seed transportation, the winged fruit, like on coltsfoot or on dandelions or on swallowwort, that looks a lot like milkweed. Sometimes the robins, the chickadees will eat the fruit and will spread the seeds as well. Or you get the burrs in the fruit, in the fur of species. One of the ones that I remember seeing is Japanese stiltgrass, and I would find it. I was doing an invasive plant survey out in the southwest corner of the state, and it was growing along the edge of the road. It had been brought in on car tires from people coming up from New York, where it was growing. And Mount Washington is a pretty remote place, but it gets a lot of people there in the summertime. And then I was finding it way, way, way into the woods. And I realized what was happening was there was a high deer population in Mount Washington. They would spend some time walking through the Japanese stiltgrass. They'd pick up the seeds from the grass. And those seeds would stay hung on until the deer actually got into a muddy place wetland seep 200, 300 feet off the road, and that mud would hang on to those seeds and pull them off. And I'd have a population of Japanese stilt grass in the middle of the woods. Just mind-blowing that it would be there already. So lots of ramets, lots of shoots from the same plant. We've got Japanese knotweed. That sends up lots of things. You cut it down and it comes up in lots of different places. Same thing is true for glossy buckthorn. You cut it down and it'll come back up, send shoots from other places. Something to watch for. One of the ones that I recently worked on trying to get listed was calorie pear, and I ran into this description. I'm going to read it quickly for you. This is from 1918 from China when it was first being brought into this country. They were looking for a species of pear that would be resistant to the fire virus, which was killing all the pear trees in this country. And calorie pear was one that seemed to work. So he said, Pyrus caloriana is simply a marvel. One finds it growing under all sorts of conditions, one time on dry, sterile mountain slopes, then again with its roots in standing water on the edge of a pond, sometimes in an open forest, then again among scrub on bluestone ledges in the burning sun, sometimes in a low bamboo jungle, and then again along the course of a fast-flowing mountain stream or on the occasionally burned-over slope of a pebbly hill. The tree is nowhere found in groves, always as scattered specimens, but very few large trees were seen. That's not true here. When calorie pear is escaping, especially to the south of us, people are seeing it in groves, lots and lots of groves. So when it doesn't have anything that's checking its population, it does very well and keeps on spreading. Another adaptation is being able to fix nitrogen. Autumn olive is a nitrogen fixer. It'll get into an area and will fix it. Some of them are really fast growing, like tree of heaven. Not a good situation. And if I talk about tree of heaven, I have to talk about the spotted lanternfly, which is attracted to tree of heaven as its primary species that it wants to eat and be with. They not only eat tree of heaven, they also will, if there's tree of heaven nearby and they're attracted to it, they'll also eat walnuts and grapes. And then they'll start working on the other hardwood trees, such as maples, oaks, cherries, etc. And when they're starving, they'll even eat pines, such as the spongy moth does when the oaks are gone. But they'll also eat hemlock, etc. So not a good situation. I have this up so that you can see what they look like in case you haven't seen any pictures of them. If you do see them, please report them to mass.gov spotted-lanternfly. They are still trying to control this. It's really important so that we can protect our landscape as long as we can. So a couple of the plants that only need one plant, so they can self-pollinate and create seed. Garlic mustard with their flowers. So when you're pulling them, make sure you destroy the flowers. Japanese barberry, same thing. It reproduces by itself, so it can just cross right there and create seeds, even without any other plant there. So where do we start? First thing you should do is figure out what you have on your property. So do you have invasive plants on your property? Figure out what you have, and then also look around your community. Look and see whether or not you have, if there are any invasives that are near to your property that are growing in your community that might cross onto it so that you know to watch for them. Think about what are the most important areas on your property, so that those are the ones that you can pay most attention to. And before you plant anything, think about what it is. The best way to prevent invasive plants from growing is to not plant them. So start thinking first, is it native? And then second, pay attention to if you're picking something up from a plant swap. Think about what people are saying about it as grows quickly, spreads easily. You don't want it. It's going to become a problem plant. They're getting rid of it because it's a problem plant, because they have too much of it. No matter how pretty the flowers are, don't take it. So how do you identify the invasive plants on your property? Well, if you don't know them, ask other people or hire an expert for your property, or get one of the smartphone apps or use 2 or 3 of them. I have a couple on my phone. I use iNaturalist regularly, and I also take most of my photos in Google because I have an Android phone. So everything goes into my Google account. And Google Lens is right there whenever it shows up a picture. But people have told me that they use Picture This. You can use Seek, which is also made by iNaturalist and has the same AI. People have also used PlantNet and have had good luck with that. So use that, check it out, see how those are for identifying what the plants are if you aren't certain. But you want to find out what's the invasive ones that you have on your property first, so you can identify that. You can also use some books. So one of the books that I like quite a bit, and I'm sorry to say it actually is not being published right at the moment, but hopefully it will be next year, is you can't see it. The first one there on the list, A Guide to Invasive Plants in Massachusetts. It's the 2nd edition. We are hoping to go for the 3rd edition, and Mass Wildlife will be printing it. We're working on updating it a little bit and pulling together the money from someplace so that we can reprint it for people. Other ones, Weeds of the Northeast is available. Newcomb's is an old wildflower guide, good oldie but goodie. Easy to use, I've always found it. Both Gleason and Cronquist, the Manual of Vascular Plants, and Arthur Haynes' Flora Novae are pretty dense. If you're not a botanist, you may find a hard time using them, but you might try using the Go Botany website, which is produced by Native Plant Trust, and they use Arthur Haynes' keys in there, but it has lots of pictures on it, so you can go through and figure out some of the pictures. One of the other books that I recommend, which is not an identification book, is Douglas Ptolemy's Bringing Nature Home, the 2nd edition. A lot of good information there, a lot to say about what invasive species can do and how to address them. So one of the things that I said, what are the special areas on your property? So this might be a place with high native plant diversity, or any rare or endangered species. Or it might be just a place you really enjoy being. So on my property, I have Isotria verticillata, which is large world pogonia. A beautiful orchid. I'm sorry, I didn't get any photos of it in bloom. I'm going to have to make sure that I get that next time, but gorgeous. I make sure that there are no glossy buckthorns, no bittersweets, anything else in these areas. I want to make sure that these plants survive and grow a long time. I also have this nice little area on the edge of a pond that I just love to come down to. You can't see it, but there is a dock off there. We go and hang out sometimes. Very pretty. It's a place that feeds my soul. And there's native wetland plants here along the edge, including another orchid. I'm a real sucker for native orchids. The little clubspur bog orchid grows along the edge of that wetland, the edge of the pond. One of the things you also might want to think about as far as the control goes is how easily can you control it? So does it have a seed bank? And will it have a long seed bank? Will you be pulling it for 7 years, like a mile a minute? Some of them don't. Some of them, you pull them and that's it. You know, they're done. Vegetation regeneration. Will it resprout? Such as the Japanese knotweed. If it's going to have that, how many repeat treatments are you going to need? What are the side effects of any of the specific controls? And you may use things besides just hand pulling. You may want to get into chemical or mechanical controls, or burning or flooding or grazing, or some of the biological controls. So think about, what are your side effects? What are you willing to put up with? There's no one right way to do this. Think about the abundance of these invasive species on your property. Do you have a lot of invasive species, or do you just have a few stands on your property? Are they scattered, patchy, widespread, dense? Pay attention to that. And do you have additional populations near your property? So where to start is different for different people and different properties. So the one option is to start and just focus on one plant, the low hanging fruit, or just in general, start with one plant so that you know you're making some difference with that. My husband right now is really, really into getting rid of all the winged euonymus around our property. And that's all. He won't touch anything else, but he's going after the winged euonymus. And I'm like, that's great. Just do that, honey. I love it. They're not easy to control, so that's great. Another option might be to start in that special area and then work out. So every time you are ready to go work on something, go to the center from your special area and work out from there until you get rid of things. It's always good to start at one spot, and each time you do start, don't keep trying to go hit or miss. You end up not making much progress. Always good to start at one spot and move forward. And then when you're done, in a couple of years after you've been doing this, reassess and say, are you actually accomplishing what you want to do? Are we getting anywhere? Are we getting these things controlled? Some of the things you might want for controlling them, if you're going to be hand pulling, like for garlic mustard, I don't always wear gloves when I'm pulling garlic mustard. I don't mind pulling it. I don't react to it. But if you're pulling it among poison ivy, you certainly are going to want to wear gloves. It looks like it's kind of cold that day where they're pulling too. Probably want to put them into a black garbage bag so that you can let that bag then sit in the sun and those plants die. Something to pay attention to. It looks like they're having a challenge here with all these people out there pulling the garlic mustard. Instead of just pulling by hand, if it's something larger, you might want to use a puller bear or a weed wrench. This is, it's got a vice grip at one end, and as you pull back, it hangs on tight and it'll pull the plant. It's a lever so that it'll pull the plant right out of the ground. Puller bear is actually the brand name of a Canadian company that makes it. Weed wrench used to be a brand name, but they stopped making that one. But so there's a couple of different ones out there that work and do the same thing. Some species come out really easily, some of them don't. But you will definitely need something more than a shovel probably to get out some of the more difficult shrubs. And probably don't want to be handling some of them like multiflora rose or Japanese barberry with your bare hands. As this person, I don't know what that plant is, but I don't think I'd be handling it with my bare hands as I'm trying to pull it. There are some biological controls. purple loosestrife across the state has actually been started to be controlled by these purple loosestrife beetles. The Gallerusella beetles, 2 different species were released. Geez, probably started being released about 15 years ago. I do see not the beetles themselves, but I see signs of the beetles all across the state. So I know that they're working. I know that they're there. And I will say, I mean, like, as with any insect that's going to be being used as control, they're not wiping out purple loosestrife. They knock it back some and they reduce its numbers, sometimes substantially. But some years they don't seem to be doing a whole lot. And sometimes that's because, something slowed their population down the previous year. And so they're responding until, if there's a lot of purple loosestrife, they'll rebound again. So it's one of those old graphs where you have, the lynx and the rabbits. But it does work. They have made a big difference as far as purple loosestrife goes. I think last year was a pretty high year. When I remember driving past some places where the loosestrife was really bad. So I expect them to be substantially less this year. In the past, people have recommended using mulch and landscape fabric over an area. I don't recommend this. For one thing, the landscape fabric can be really difficult to get rid of long-term. So at this point, I'm saying don't use mulch and landscape fabric. Not a good way to handle things. It gets very messy. Long-term is a real problem. You can, for most plants, you can cut the stems and remove the sprouts regularly. So you have to cut them flush, so there's no green branches there at all. And then you'd have to come back and trim them again, probably at least once a month. And it may take 2 years before you've gotten rid of things. But for many of the woody plants, especially, if you do this, you will get rid of that plant. Even glossy buckthorn will disappear with that. So that's one thing that you can do. Not all of the, some of the herbaceous species that are seed banks, annuals, you're going to have to be doing a lot more with, but those would be hand pulling whenever you see them. My organization uses a lot of herbicides to help control invasive plants on our properties, the Mass Wildlife properties. I'm actually an herbicide applicator, and I learned to become an applicator, took all the tests, because I wanted to be able to go in and do very discrete spot treatments to control the invasive plants that are growing right around the rare plants, so that I could do something without disrupting the roots, without hurting the rare plants. And so for some places, herbicides are the best thing to use. But always use with caution. Always read and follow the directions on the containers so that you've got the correct application rate. Just because you're buying these over the counter at your local gardening center doesn't mean that they are safe. You really do need to wear the protective gear, and you want to wash that. Any clothing that you use herbicides in, wash it separately from other clothing so you're not spreading it around. I always say avoid spraying any herbicide on open flowers. Only spray it on the leaves or the stems. Most of the herbicides actually are contact on the plants themselves. It won't work if you pour it on the ground. It doesn't do anything in the soil. The soil actually does often absorbs and attaches and binds up the herbicides. Don't ever spray over your head. Cut the plant to something level or down to the ground, let it resprout, and then treat it if that's how you want to do it. And don't spray on windy days so that you don't end up hitting plants that you don't want to impact with herbicide. You might want to get a Norway maple. I mean, you might want to get a goat to control your Norway maple, or a Japanese knotweed. There are places, and I'm pretty sure there's people who lease goats out that are on the Cape. I know that there are people who are doing it on both Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So I'm betting that there are people who are doing it also on the Cape. So these guys are great. They work well. They like to eat shrubs better than they like to eat things that are on the ground. They like to eat up. But I've also had them take out poison ivy, and they're a good way to do that. Another thing that my organization does, agency, is controlled burning. This works some, it's not 100%. So I'm not certainly going to recommend it to homeowners to go out and do a lot of burning. It does help some. It does help a number of the native plants. It does help get rid of, a thick thatch that's out there. And some of the rare plants really, really do need to have an environment that regularly does get burned. They grew up with, they evolved to have fire over them on occasion. But if you do burning, you do have to have permits, and you do want to have lots of training, and there's all kinds of, lots of restrictions. DCR does a fair amount of it. Mass Wildlife does a fair amount of it, but at this time of year, and often in the fall as well. So just going over a couple of the newly listed invasive plants. One of them is the Japanese black pine, Pinus thunbergii. It likes sandy soil, and I know it occurs in Orleans. I've actually poked around and looked on iNaturalist for these and found that, yes, indeed, you do have Japanese black pine there. It spreads like crazy. It grows fast. It does seem that if you can cut it down, it doesn't do a lot of resprouting. So that's a good thing. It is a species that MDAR is going to be holding a hearing on soon, because the people who do a lot of bonsai like to use this plant for bonsai. Who knew? We didn't know about that until after it got listed. So MDAR is looking at whether or not they should allow some exception for its use as a bonsai tree. That's what the hearing is that's coming up. I think that's April 9th. I'm not positive, but I think so. Another species that was recently listed is Scotch broom, which also really likes sandy soil. This one also seems that if you can cut it in the spring, flush to the ground with nothing left on it, it seems that it does knock it down pretty thoroughly. You probably will have to go back and check it a couple times, make sure that you actually got all of it, but that does seem to help. Otherwise, it produces tons of seed. Look at all those flowers. It's very pretty, but yeah, yuck. You don't need just that growing out there. One of the ones that, this one I'm very concerned with, which is weeping lovegrass. This was introduced from Africa. We seem to have a culture right now of people being really interested in planting pretty grasses. And we have a lot of pretty native grasses. I think that little blue stem and broom, what is it? I'm not even going to remember what it is. There's a number of very pretty grasses of ours, but people aren't planting those. They are planting grasses such as weeping lovegrass or miscanthus, silver, whatever it is. Sorry. Look at what is native. Because grass is grass, people tend to not see it. They kind of look at grasses and go, oh, it's a grass, no problem. But they do. They are major problems. They really are taking over, and they are a problem. Japanese stiltgrass is one example. I grew up in Pennsylvania. The woods there did not used to have Japanese stiltgrass in them. I spent a lot of time in the Poconos there. It was fine. I took my daughters there to show them the camp that I used to go to, and it's just carpets of Japanese stiltgrass now. Horrifying to see. And it's a grass. People ignored it because it was a grass. Don't ignore the grasses. They can be problems too. Another one that's coming in is wall lettuce. This one's it's been around for a while, but it hasn't been really a target of, look at this is really spreading. It's got an interesting looking leaf with these little leaflets on the main stem that point backwards. And the 5-petaled flowers, it's in the Asteraceae, has the seeds that spread like crazy. Where I've seen it, it has just spread and spread and spread. It is a real concern. And you do, even though where I've seen it has been mostly thin organic, slightly damp soil, and often along a trail or something. I don't know where it's occurring. I did check to make sure that it was something that you actually get in Orleans, and it is. Another one that's, as I mentioned, we just listed recently was the Callery pear. Lots of blooms early. This is a 3-year-old plant, and it already is covered with blooms. It is not, fortunately, a plant that will produce fruit unless there is a second Callery pear that's not a clone of this one. So pretty leaves in the fall, they stand out. Pretty distinctive plant, however. So not one that you want. Absolutely. And this one actually, as I said, MDAR is holding a hearing on this one as well, because its rootstock is the primary rootstock that is resistant to the fire virus that is taking out, and still is, that was taking out pear trees back in the early 1900s. It still is affecting pear trees, except for that they now put all of your pear trees are grafted onto the roots of this plant. So they're looking for some exceptions and figuring out how to handle that so that people who have and want to grow pears can still plant this species. Not the species, not the upper part of it, but the roots with the pear stock on it and grafted onto it. So a little bit of review. You might want to, for picking your battles, you might want to start with the low-hanging fruit if you have lots of invasives, or you might want to start with a special part of your property that you want to make sure stays free of invasives and work out from there. And make sure that you reassess in a couple of years. So I worked on this with Cynthia Betnier, and I have to give her credit because a lot of these ideas were hers. She used to work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and she helped a lot with some of the assessment suggestions. And I have to, since I work for Mass Wildlife, I have to say something. If you do see rare species, please do report them at the Mass Wildlife Heritage Hub. You can also donate to us, not just to Orleans Conservation Trust. You could donate to both of us. We do have a line on the income tax return. If you haven't turned in your taxes yet, you can make a donation directly to us that way. And if you want to stay connected, we've got a monthly e-newsletter that you can sign up for. We also have a magazine that I occasionally write articles for. If you have any questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Karro. That was very informative and perhaps a little daunting, but we've got some good questions coming in, so let me dive right in. So when using goats, are you really just using them to get the invasives cut back to a point where you can then treat them with an herbicide or remove them mechanically? Wouldn't they just resprout?
So some of the invasives will resprout. There's no question about that. I actually haven't used them heavily personally, so I don't have a lot of personal experience with it. We do have partners that use them regularly on Martha's Vineyard. And they will usually graze them at certain times of the year around invasive. Well, they'll use the goats to graze an area where we have rare plants that will show up at one point of the year, either really early in the year or really towards the fall. They'll graze that area at the opposite end. So if it's a fall blooming flower, such as New England blazing star, they may graze the goats in that area in the spring so that any invasive shrubs and things like that are munched down pretty low and being kept down. So it's kind of, people are often using them as a maintenance, not so much as this will get them knocked down and get rid of the invasives. It does depend on the invasive plant, though. I mean, I think if you had Norway maple, they would probably do quite a number on them. I do know that they like to eat Japanese knotweed, but I don't know that they would take it out.
Mm-hmm. Good. Is there an easy way to identify the Japanese black pine that you were mentioning?
I would say look at pictures and compare. It usually has some white tips. I could go back to that slide maybe and see if I can. I'm not quite sure how to. Well, it's not going to be back too far, right?
And if I'm right, that one has the pine needles in clusters of 2 as
Yes.
opposed to, or
yes. I find, because I'm not a person who ends up working with these pines very often, I find it sort of hard to tell them apart. I'm sorry to say, but they are in needles of 2, and their buds initially look very white. So this is a spring picture. I think if you look at them in the fall, they look very white, and you can see it there. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better photo of that than that. Thank you for that question. You're helping me come up with better photos for next time around. I'll make myself a note.
Any tips on removing bittersweet? Do animals eat the berries?
Animals will eat the berries. It's one of those species that is closely related to our native American bittersweet. Very closely related. They both are vines. They both produce berries. So animals will eat that. Best tips that I have come up with for dealing with it is cut it down to the ground. So if you have it going up a tree, cut it down to the ground, cut a second section so that those 2 don't meet, but cut one piece all the way down to the ground, and then just watch for it to come back up. Don't try and take it out of the trees. You will damage the tree if it's gone up it. Let that vinyl come down on its own. I know it's not pretty, but it will come down on its own without hurting anything. But watch for those resprouts, because it will resprout initially. So you want to make sure that you catch those early and often. So those are one of those ones where you want to check along the whole length of the root, where that, or the whole area around it. So if you cut it down, make sure you're checking out from that old stump quite a ways, 5, 10 feet, regularly, once a month at least, to look for resprouts and take those out. Because as soon as it's got a leaf there, it's generating energy for its roots.
Yeah, it definitely takes persistence, but that's one of the worst invasives we have here in Orleans. So if you're going to do as Karro suggested and maybe focus on one species to start, that one would rank pretty highly on my own personal list. Any thoughts on lily of the valley?
It's not a listed species as far as invasiveness goes. It does persist. There are lilies of the valley planted on my road, and there's no houses anywhere near. There never have been. I'm sure somebody planted them over 100 years ago, and they are still there because there's no reason for them ever to have been there. I showed you a picture of the pond that's near my house. That used to be an ice pond. So my guess is probably someone decided to plant it when it wasn't being used as an ice pond. Of course, this year it didn't even freeze over. So yeah.
Let's see, someone said, what about vines, natives and invasives? So I'm guessing that question is about kind of whether it's necessary to manage native vines as well as invasives.
So I don't worry about the native vines as much. Douglas Ptolemy certainly does. In his book, he recommends that you take out the native vines as well. He doesn't like, for example, he doesn't like any of the grapes. I tend to figure that grapes grew up with have been involving with most of our trees for a long time. I don't usually see them doing major damage, but I think occasionally they can get to the point where they're very aggressive. You might want to take them out. There are native birds and insects that do rely on grapes, that want to have grapes, that they're a really good food for those. So they would want to have them. But you also don't want to be losing your trees in your forest to a grape infestation. So you might want to cut them back some, but I wouldn't necessarily say you have to take everything out, or cut the biggest ones that you see that seem to be the biggest problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I would pay attention mostly to things like the bittersweet. Hopefully you don't have any hardy kiwi being planted there because it will rip your trees down. Those are the two main invasive ones that I'm mostly concerned with. I don't see poison ivy taking down trees, but it certainly does grow all the way around them.
We
But
definitely have porcelain berry in a couple of our properties. That's another invasive vine that can get pretty darn aggressive.
yes, yep.
Someone asked, can you provide some examples of low-hanging fruit invasives on the Cape?
On the Cape.
And I can give you an assist if you'd like.
Well, you could give me assist. I would say that one of the ones that's easily dealt with is the mile a minute. You can pull it very easily. You can reduce it. You can start out with a huge patch, and as long as you are willing to do something monthly, go back out and check it. You can control it. Go ahead, Stephen. You have some others.
We see a lot of Morrow's honeysuckle or shrub honeysuckle on our property. So that's a shrub that can get pretty large, but it's pretty easy to pull out. So that the weed wrench that Karro showed in one of her slides is a great tool to be able to uproot those. If you just cut them, they'll resprout and resprout and resprout. So you really have to be persistent if you're just gonna cut them, but they're not too bad to uproot.
They're actually, because they're very shallow rooted, it's amazing how large a shrub you can pull up even with your hands without even using the weed wrench. It's like, well, that's amazing because its roots are all right on the surface.
Yeah. And it's one that you have to be careful about, how you dispose of it, because if you just kind of leave it there on the ground, it'll probably start growing again.
As a lot of them will, unfortunately. Yeah.
Let's see, does OCT visit residential homes to discuss best practices for planting as well as to help identify invasive species? And does Agway, one of our local nurseries, have a list of plants that OCT advises Orleans residents plant? So OCT does not visit individual properties for that purpose. However, part of this At Home with Nature initiative that I described in part of the intro is to try to provide residents with the resources that they need to make their own informed decisions as well as we'll have plenty of opportunities to kind of get people out on our properties so they have experience, A, identifying in the field, and B, properly removing invasive plants on our properties, with the idea that they'll be able to take those skills home and hopefully do the same on their own properties. And then a lot of our local nurseries on Cape have joined the Pollinator Pathway Cape Cod, which is a group that has come together since 2020, several local organizations. And so those nurseries that have joined Pollinator Pathway Cape Cod do often have a specific native plant section. So look for those natives, and if they don't have that section, ask somebody there. It's one of the best ways to communicate to these nurseries that there's a real demand for planting natives. There's lots of good plant lists out there, including one on the Pollinator Pathway Cape Cod website or their webpage. Let's see, I've been making progress removing a dense thicket of bittersweet. What can I plant in its place? This is a good question. Once you've opened up a lot of space after invasive removal, the person who asked that question notes that other invasives such as garlic mustard are moving in.
That's sad. So I would say, look at your resource there that you just gave, Stephen, about the pollinator pathway, and looking at what is being recommended there. And probably because you're getting things like garlic mustard moving in, you probably want to be able to put in a shrub or two, something that's going to grow a little bit higher than just ground level, something that will be taller than your garlic mustard.
Someone asked, can you share your iNaturalist profile? It would be cool to follow you. So,
it's my name.
okay.
So it's Karro_Frost if you want to know.
Great, thank you.
I should go back to my question slide so you can see my name.
Someone asked about herbicides and whether there are certain herbicides you suggest.
There are a couple that you can get over the counter. I do use Roundup or other glyphosate-based herbicides. They tend to be for mammals, which is what people are, very safe, even though they're really very toxic for the plants. They interfere with how the plants store things. So if you use something like Roundup, use it from midsummer into fall. The other one that I use, that I personally use, is I don't know what I think it's called Garlon, that you can get over the counter. I'm not positive. I think it also might be in something called Brush Be Gone, but the main herbicide is triclopyr. You want to be very careful with that around your eyes because can be very bad for your eyes. Wear goggles and things like that when you're doing it. And that's one that impacts the plants growing at the beginning of the season. So I might use that in the springtime. And I've used that particularly successfully with swallowwort. So that's one of the ones that really impacts swallowwort a whole lot better. And we always go through and take off all the seeds and all the flowers first before we treat.
And I think if you're somebody who doesn't have experience using herbicides, I would always recommend starting small. Definitely read the label, as Karro said, and as much as you can do kind of a cut and wipe or very limited application, so you're not spraying large areas. That's always best to avoid any of those unintended consequences that Karro referenced.
Yeah. One of the ways that I've used on something like glossy buckthorn is we actually have what's called a buckthorn blaster that you put herbicide inside, a concentrated herbicide, and it has a sponge tip on the end of it. So when you cut it, you dab the end onto the cut stem there, and it takes it out. The plant will suck the herbicide down into its roots, and that's it. It doesn't go anywhere else besides that. So it's very Very directed. You're not getting it anywhere other than just that one cut stem.
Someone says, I have an invasion of Agapodium or bishop's weed. What do you suggest for that?
I'm sorry. I'd be crying. So one of the things that I've had people do in the past has been very carefully digging those out. The other thing that you might want to do is either, if you don't want to use herbicide, get somebody who will come in and use herbicide on it. Those are the two things that I can suggest that would be successful, but both of them are, it's not an easy plant to get rid of. It's terrible. I mean, some of them are worse than others. I talked about being able to cut Scotch broom and it not resprouting very quickly has been our experience so far. And the Japanese black pine, apparently, if you can cut it, it will not do a lot of resprouting, but
many of the trees in Orleans are smothered by ivy, and I think specifically this is English ivy. And the question is it native? Does it harm the trees?
So yes, all of those. This might be a good time for me to talk about, I have 6 more slides that talk about some of the ones that I'm concerned with. And
let me jump to one more question and then
okay.
We'll circle back to this.
Okay, that's
I
one.
want to get to this one. Is all privet invasive? It seems like landscapers are still planting a lot of privet hedges and nurseries are still selling it.
So they are not all listed on the MyPag list. And part of that is because they're very difficult to tell the difference between the different species of privet. So we do have one of them that's listed there. There's none that are native. So privet is a non-native to begin with, but they're not all listed as being invasive. So they are something that I'm concerned with, but we haven't pushed on that one to try and get them all listed. We've gotten a lot of pushback. Every so often we run into a group of species, and because MyPag consists not only of people who are the botanists and the researchers, we also include the people who grow plants. The nursery owners are also well represented on there, and they really have pushed back very hard whenever we come up with something that is really important to them. And apparently the privets really are. So
good, thank you. Well, I'll turn it back to you for a couple more slides.
Okay, so a couple of other plants that I'm concerned with. Some of them are listed, some of them aren't. Specifically on Cape Cod, we've got gray willow. This one I find growing around coastal plain ponds. It's got these very distinctive oval leaves. The bark on these guys, it looks like if you were to strip the bark off and look at the wood, it's got ridges in it underneath. Very distinctive plant, and just is taking over a lot of those pond shores. And because it's taking over the pond shores, we're not getting the rare species that like to grow in that unusual community. Another one that I'm concerned with that is not listed yet and is not native here is the common yucca, Yucca filamentosa. This is one we've tried to do some control with at Webner, which is down in Falmouth, and at Wacoit Bay, that's what else it's called. We haven't successfully been able to get rid of this yet, just by digging it up or burning through it. It keeps resprouting. So it's one I'm concerned with. It does keep spreading. It is not native. This is one I'm hoping that we can get listed this year, the Chinese bush clover, Lespedeza cuneata. We have a lot of native Lespedezas. We have a couple that are non-native. This is one of the non-native ones, and it's a real problem. It just spreads and spreads and spreads. And then we have the English ivy. Unfortunately, this was one that I found on a coastal plain pond shore. I was surveying for Plymouth gentian, And I was finding this, and then I was going to go to another pond. I think this actually was either in Orleans or maybe Brewster, one town west from you. And I went to the next pond shore and found it just completely coating all the trees so that you couldn't even get to the pond on the old access way. And another one that I'm very concerned with is winter creeper, which this is one that we've had the nursery industry really, really pushing hard on us. And just, it's taking over. This is actually photos from Sandwich that I took to document that it was there. One of the things that I would encourage anyone to do is, if you are on iNaturalist, please do take pictures of invasive plants, especially if they have not yet been listed, because that helps us get them listed. So please do take good photos of the privet so that we can show that it's jumping out and being invasive. Take pictures of winter creeper, take pictures of the Lespedeza cuneata as well. So we use those. We can say, look at the documentation that we have of this species in these areas. And that's it. Those are my last ones.
Well, definitely some important ones, and somewhat discouraging that the list keeps growing, but
Yeah.
We've got, I think, just two more questions. One about creeping bellflower and whether you have any suggestions for managing that.
I'm not sure what species that is. Creeping bell?
Yeah, creeping bellflower. I wasn't familiar with that either, but
No, I'm sorry. I would say with anything, track it back as much as you can. If it's creeping, it probably is one that's coming from a main stem someplace, and try and attack the main stem there.
okay. And then, are you concerned yet about viburnum dilatatum? I think it's invasive in some states south of here, and I'm pretty sure I'm seeing it in my woods.
So if you are seeing it in your woods, please do take photos of it, and please do put it up on iNaturalist, or get a friend to do it if you're not on iNaturalist yourself. Yes, it's not high on our list because I'm not running into it yet, but it is something that it would be great if people to document. We need that documentation in order to get things on the list.
And the best way to document, you think, is iNaturalist for folks who want to get involved?
That is probably the easiest way, and it's the most accessible way to do it. You can always put in notes that this is one of several shrubs, or take a picture of several of them all growing together, or a patch or something like that as part of your documentation. But yeah, make sure you're taking photos that are identifiable.
Yeah. One more, because I'm curious to hear your response to this one. What about daylilies? Are they considered, or do you consider them invasive?
They're not considered invasive. There are a lot of plants. One of the things with daylilies is they don't tend to produce a lot of viable seed. And certainly the original orange daylilies that were planted everywhere didn't produce a lot of viable seed. So they would just stay put. I'm not sure that that's still true. There are a lot of varieties that are being planted out there now. But right now, we don't have any daylilies on the list. So if you are seeing daylilies spreading on their own, like by seed, we would want to know about it. And, again, please feel free to write to me about that if you would like. Let me go back to my tag, my name here. I would be very interested to see, anything about that.
Or I'm sure we could pick your brain about species by species for many more hours, but I think we'll wrap it up there and really want to thank you for your time and all your work. It's so important what you do. And I think you have an especially valuable perspective kind of on both sides of the rare plant species that we need to preserve, as well as the ubiquitous invasives that we need to decide how we're going to carefully manage those. So,
well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. As I said, I enjoy doing these talks, so it's great.
and thank you all for attending, and hopefully folks have had a chance to get Karro's info here if they want to follow up. OCT will send an email out tomorrow as well. So Karro, if it's okay with you, we can share your contact info there too.
Yep, no problem.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
All right, bye now.